The HOA tried to tow my Mercedes for improper parking, not realizing that I'm the city's chief prosecutor. They regretted it the moment they found out who I was. But let's start from the beginning. Saturday morning was surprisingly peaceful. James Wilson, the county's chief prosecutor, sat in his spacious office, sipping freshly brewed coffee. The faint scent of oak lingered in the air, coming from the massive bookshelf filled with legal literature. He was about to finish work on an important case when his phone suddenly rang. The number was familiar. Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, known for her love of gossip and uncanny ability to appear in the most unexpected situations. "James," her voice was tense. "Your car! They're about to tow it." He frowned, leaned back in his chair, and took off his glasses. "Wait, who's they?" he asked, still trying to grasp the situation. "The HOA. They're here with a tow truck. They're saying you broke some new rules." For a second, James just sat there, processing what he had just heard. His car had been parked in the same spot, in front of his own house, for years. How could he possibly be breaking a rule that didn't exist before? "I'm on my way." He grabbed his keys, left his office, got into his car, and hit the gas. As he drove home, his mind raced. He knew very well that the HOA in their neighborhood wasn't just a homeowners association. It was a mini dictatorship run by Mrs. Richardson, a woman with an unshakable sense of self-importance and a thirst for power. But this? A few minutes later, he slammed on the brakes in front of his house. A massive yellow tow truck, lights flashing, was parked right by his driveway. Parking enforcement workers were already securing his black Mercedes S-Class onto the platform, metal clamps tightening around the front wheels. Standing nearby were 3 members of the HOA, 2 women and 1 man. Leading this small group, like a general before battle, was Mrs. Linda Richardson, the HOA president, a woman in her 50s with sharp features, a short haircut, and her signature condescending smirk. She was dressed in an expensive gray suit, as if to remind everyone of her supposed authority. She wasn't even surprised to see him. "Mr. Wilson," she drawled, crossing her arms over her chest. "Your car is in violation of parking regulations. It's parked 2 inches closer to the curb than permitted." James slowly looked at his Mercedes. It was parked exactly where it had been for the past 3 years. Absolutely nothing had changed. "This must be some mistake," he said calmly, but his voice had taken on a steely edge. "There's no such rule in the HOA regulations." Richardson's smirk widened as if she enjoyed delivering bad news. "We recently updated them," she said, pulling a document from her folder and handing it to him. James took the paper, scanning the text. It had been printed just yesterday. He could still smell the fresh ink. His eyes narrowed as he read the ridiculous new regulation. Any vehicle parked closer than 12 inches from the curb is subject to immediate removal. But the most interesting part was at the bottom of the page. There was only one signature, Linda Richardson's. "These new rules weren't approved by the majority of homeowners," he said, lifting his gaze to her. "This is illegal." "You're welcome to file a complaint," Richardson shrugged. "But first, we're taking your car." "You have no right." "We're the HOA. We have the right to do anything." She gestured to the tow truck driver. The parking enforcement worker hesitated, then nodded reluctantly and reached for the lever to secure the car completely. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. Some had already taken out their phones to record the incident. James clenched his fists. He could feel their attempt to bully and humiliate him, but they had picked the wrong target. This was personal. The tow truck's engine roared, and the steel cables tightened, preparing to lift the black Mercedes S-Class onto the platform. The tow operator, a man in his 50s with the exhausted look of someone used to confrontation, slowly reached for the lever, then froze as James stepped forward. "Take your hands off my car." His voice was calm, but laced with an unmistakable warning. The tow operator hesitated, his hand hovering over the lever. His expression shifted. He clearly wanted no part of this mess, especially with the county's chief prosecutor standing right in front of him. But before he could respond, a soft yet firm voice cut through the air from behind. "Proceed." The tow operator slowly turned toward the speaker. Mrs. Richardson stood there, arms crossed, her lips curling into a cold, smug smile. She was enjoying this. James turned his gaze to her. "You have no authority to do this," he said, his voice still controlled but laced with tension. "This is illegal." She held a dramatic pause, as if savoring the moment, before tilting her head slightly. "This is a violation of our rules, Mr. Wilson, and you are expected to comply." The crowd murmured. People exchanged glances, whispering. "Can they really do this?" someone muttered. "This is ridiculous," another voice called out, and a few others joined in with their own expressions of outrage. The tension thickened. The air was charged, the kind of pressure that only builds before an explosion. But Richardson ignored it all. She pretended not to hear the crowd, her focus locked on James, lazily watching him as if testing how far he would go. She loved watching people squirm. And then she said the words that crossed the line. "Next time, think twice before breaking the rules." She nodded to the tow truck driver, confirming her order. The steel cables tightened even more. At that moment, James snapped. He felt the heat boil inside him, not the reckless kind of anger, but the kind that burns cold, the kind that ignites when you realize someone is trying to crush you through sheer arrogance and unchecked power. But he wasn't going to back down. If they thought they could steamroll him, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The crowd held its breath. For several seconds, no one moved. The tow truck operator stood frozen, his hands on the lever, ready to activate the mechanism at any moment. Mrs. Richardson still wore her smug grin, confident that she had won. But James wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. Without a word, he pulled out his phone, swiftly dialed a number, and brought it to his ear. "This is James Wilson, Chief Prosecutor of the county." His voice was cold, sharp, and absolute. "I need police assistance at address. The HOA is illegally towing my vehicle." The words sliced through the air like a knife. Everything froze. Richardson stiffened. Her smugness vanished in an instant. Her eyes widened, the muscles in her face twitched, and her smirk evaporated. "Chief, Prosecutor?" one of the HOA board members muttered, staring at her in horror. The crowd stirred. People began whispering even more intensely, their phones now capturing not just a dispute, but a scandal. Richardson swallowed hard. She realized she had lost control of the situation. 10 minutes later, a sharp wail of police sirens echoed in the distance. The crowd parted as a patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. Officer Spencer, a rugged, square-jawed man in his mid-40s, stepped out of the car. His sharp eyes took in the scene with the look of a man who had seen it all. As soon as he spotted James, his expression shifted. "James? What's going on here?" The prosecutor took a step forward, his voice firm and unwavering. "The HOA is attempting to tow my vehicle based on fabricated rules that don't exist in any official documentation. This is abuse of authority." Spencer's eyes narrowed. He smelled bullshit immediately. He turned to Richardson, who now stood far less confidently, and held out his hand. "The documents." She hesitated, then nervously handed them over. Spencer scanned the pages in silence, his face growing harsher with every line he read. After a few seconds, he snapped the papers shut and locked eyes with her. "This has no legal standing. You cannot tow his car." The crowd erupted. But... Richardson stammered, her confidence crumbling. Spencer turned back to James, his voice growing even louder. In fact, this is an abuse of power. This could qualify as fraud and official misconduct. I'll be forwarding this to the prosecutor's office. The crowd exploded with murmurs and exclamations. Richardson's face went pale as a sheet. She finally understood. This was no bluff. She had lost. The crowd was still buzzing with conversation, but James wasn't listening anymore. He stood across from Richardson, arms crossed over his chest. There was no anger in his gaze, just the calm confidence of a man who knew he had already won. Now it's my turn. Richardson's face drained of color. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't find the words. The crowd no longer looked at her with respect. Now they looked at her with curiosity, amusement, even schadenfreude. She could feel her power slipping away. 2 weeks later, James was sitting in his office when a folder marked "Official Investigation" landed on his desk. He opened it and wasn't surprised. For years, Richardson had turned the HOA into her personal empire. She extorted fines, funneled HOA funds into lavish vacations, handed out contracts to friends and relatives, all disguised as community improvements, but in reality, she stole, and she stole big. The investigation was swift. 1 month later, a headline hit the local newspaper. HOA scandal. President indicted for fraud. The HOA held an emergency meeting. She was removed. A week later, the prosecutor's office officially charged her. It was a total victory. Sometime later, the sun was setting as James parked his Mercedes in front of his house in the exact same spot as always. No one dared to touch it anymore. From behind a fence, Mrs. Henderson, his ever-curious neighbor, peeked out. She squinted at the scene, then smirked. "I hope you'll let us know if anyone tries to pull another stunt like that." James smiled. Always. He walked inside, leaving behind a street where order had finally been restored.